Okay, so we're in game. Let's try first giving ourselves the 44. So let's open the console. Let's open the console on there so it's easier to read. And we're going to go help, which lets us search for entries. And we're just going to type 44. The next thing that we type is a number, which determines how the entries are displayed. I'm going to go for 4. And then wep, because you can leave this blank, but typing wep will only show wep entries or weapons. So we have several entries. We're going to have to try each one. So if I do player add item, you don't need to type the zeros out at the front. You can just skip those. So we got it. And then we can favorite this as well. Cool. Now let's look for our weapon which we just made. So again, help, hunting, forward, and there it is at the bottom, hunting revolver. First number is basically the ESP order, so 24 is the 24th loaded ESP as far as I know. Oh baby. So now we have a hunting revolver in the game. Obviously the hammer doesn't move or anything, but it's a good blockout to be able to tell, I did leave that part in, exactly how the size is. So there is one mod I use called Fallout 4 hotkeys, very useful. I can hit buttons on my mouse to show and hide the UI. I can also use a button to activate TFC mode to pop the camera out, hotkeys to change the field of view, and change the speed of the camera so I can really get a good look at the weapon model that I'm creating. So yeah, if the camera starts flying around, don't worry too much about it, I'm just spamming hotkeys. So this part is more about checking the scale of the weapon. Does it look good in the hands? Does it look good in first person? If I take a look at a distance, does it look about right? And generally, yeah, just checking scale. It's as simple as that. That looks pretty good to me. Let's make sure to also hotkey it so we can quickly swap back to it. So there is one thing I'll say. It's not always best to save when you've already spawned the weapon in your hands. It's often best to instead load a save file and then spawn the weapon in your hands, just so that everything is updated and you don't have any sort of old loaded information. I'm not entirely sure how to describe it as an artist, but yeah, just make sure you spawn the weapon for yourself every time. So at this point it's probably worth talking about where the vanilla animation and custom animation modding paths, if you like, start to diverge. If you know you're going to have custom animations for your weapon, you don't really need to worry about the position of moving parts on the gun, that is, the position of the bones and the nodes. However, if you do want to line up your gun with vanilla animations, you need to pay much more attention to bone positions. So, just as an example, I detached up this mesh so that you got the hammer, cylinder and the bullets all separate, and then I made sure, so this is something I didn't mention before, reset X form. What this does is it essentially resets the transforms of the mesh. So if you've made a lot of changes and you go to reset X form, reset selected, and then collapse that, or if I've got a shortcut for it, just watch here. There, it's quite quick, and I do that most of the time just before I export a mesh, just so that I know that the transforms are going to end up where I think they're going to end up, and the result is this. So if the pivot point is, so the pivot point for the frame is obviously up here where I created that shape, the hammer is here where it's at the pivot, and if we take a look at the exported NIF, then we can see that the hammer, it's kind of hard to tell with the cylinder in the way, but the hammer is at the pivot point, is the center, and the frame is also, its pivot is at the center of the scene, so you can get nice and predictable mesh positions when you export. So then I did as before, I right clicked and copied the block and then went in. I used the 44 vanilla NIF for reference to find out where exactly these meshes are supposed to go, for example the hammer. All I did was I block pasted and that put the tri-shape in. The name was wrong, so I went down here, clicked here and made sure I selected 44 Magnum hammer in this case, and it also needed a lighting shader property. This part is important. So we already know that the receiver has a lighting shader property. However, if I was to import a block, paste a block, and then try and set node 35 as the lighting shader property, that means that two tri-shapes share the same shading property, and that'll crash your game. It's not good. So instead, we right click the shader property and then copy that and then paste it onto the new mesh, and that gives it an exactly the same lighting shader property effectively, but with a different node number. That's pretty important. Another thing which is pretty important to do, well, it's just a nice sort of housekeeping method, is to go to sanitize reorder blocks. What this does is it makes sure all your nodes are sort of in the right order, I think. So obviously we start with node 0 as we go down the list, 1, 2, 3, 4. If you start to paste things in, it tends to mess with the order. So sanitizing and reordering your blocks is a good way to make sure everything is where it needs to be. So let's take a look at where the meshes are in relation to the bone position. So for example, the hammer, I've got nodes turned on up here, so you need that turned on to be able to see. What you're seeing here is the origin of the tri-shape, and if we go up one level, here is the position of the bone. So I've manually moved the tri-shape into the position that it should be. This is bad. Don't do it. What's exactly happened here is it's just like in 3ds Max when you have a pivot that is off position. When you rotate something, it doesn't do what you expect. So let's go in game and see what kind of effect that actually had on the weapon. Here we are in game with our updated NIF. So if you watch the hammer closely, you'll notice if I put it into slower motion, the hammer actually clicks out of position backwards, and also you'll notice that the cylinder and the bullets inside actually rotate off kilter. It sort of moves out of place there, and that's because as well the cylinder and the bullets are out of place in terms of the pivot. Oh wow. Yeah, it's not too bad, but it can be a lot worse. So, if you did want to model your weapon and have it conform to vanilla animations and work with the vanilla animations without much clipping, you would probably just want to do what I've already done and import a weapon. You wouldn't want the load NIF because it has everything already combined in. You'd want to import the NIFs for the object parts themselves, so that you can have them separated, and then you'd simply snap the parts to the origins. I'll do it now, just to demonstrate. So I get the receiver in. Let's hide all of these, and then what you do is you'd simply align this tool up here and click on the mesh you want to align with, and then you have the hammer, so you get the hammer and align it. You maybe pre-rotate that one, and yeah, that's effectively what you do if you want to make your gun line up with vanilla animations. One last thing I wanted to add: if you want to animate for vanilla animations, if you want to get your bone positions so that they just work with vanilla animations, you can actually do custom animations later on. In fact, it's probably better if you animate, think about animations vanilla wise, if you have your bone positions working with vanilla and then do custom animations later, because if you think about it, if there's animations that you don't necessarily want to do, you can just make use of the vanilla ones. For example, third person, if you simply say I was doing custom animations for first person and I did all of those, then in third person I could just set it, my revolver to use the 4D4 animations, and it would just work. The weapons would be in the correct positions and everything.